On May 30th, 2015, Chris Highland, former Presbyterian Minister, interfaith chaplain, author, and educator, spoke at a San Francisco Atheists meeting on the topic Nature is Enough, the title of his photo book.
Well, it is. Thank you, Susan. I thank you for inviting me, and it's good to see Terry again and to be a part of the Clergy Project, but really more to experience what it means to emerge from leadership in the Protestant tradition and the religious traditions, and try to see what's next. What comes after that? What grows? What can grow? What's potential? What's emerging? There are a lot of progressives in many different faith traditions who are talking about the emerging church, the emerging synagogue, these other kinds of things. And I think we have an opportunity. I think we have an opportunity to find ways of finding bridges to connect people so it's not so much polarizing. So I kind of want to talk about that a bit. But I wanted to start with a little story. It's not the most recent. It's not the Galapagos. That's pretty exciting stuff. But this happened to me some years back. I was in Yellowstone National Park. Can everybody hear me? Everybody can hear me fine? Yeah. I was in Yellowstone National Park, and I was in a kind of a congregation of people, but it wasn't a religious congregation. It was a congregation of people who were there to see wild things, kind of why we go to national parks. And we were looking down into the Hayden Valley. Anybody been to Yellowstone? Been to Yellowstone? So the Hayden Valley is like a drama. It's like a stage set up for the drama of nature. And we were quite a crowd standing there by the side of the road looking down in this valley, and people had their scopes and all of their video cameras and their cameras and all that stuff. But people started spotting right by the river a good-sized grizzly, and that grizzly was feeding on an elk carcass right there by the river. And not too far away was a dead tree, some branches sticking out over the river, two bald eagles sitting there waiting for their lunch. So they're watching this. So that was pretty dramatic. We're seeing all this happening. The grizzly, the elk, the eagles. Out of the forest behind them, a ways, comes running a moose calf. So a small moose comes bursting out of the forest, running almost toward this grizzly. Behind it, right behind it, was a large coyote. We thought it was a wolf, but it really was a coyote chasing down a small moose. So all of this is happening in one scene in a valley for this congregation of people looking for wildness. Well, we got it. We got it that day. And I guess I partly tell that story because people would respond, as we all do, with the, wow, whoa, did you see that? You know, look, see that, look at that, look at that. And this kind of holy shit moment when people are saying, whoa, this is happening right now. All of these creatures here, the grizzly, the elk, the eagles, the coyote, the moose, what else is going to happen, you know? So in those moments, I think we didn't have anybody say, well, let's stop and say a prayer, you know, let's, you know, praise God at this moment. It wasn't that kind of a thing. Maybe some people were thinking that. But there's no time in those awesome moments of wonder when it's just right there in front of you. And you think, do we really want anything else? Is there something more than that we really want? So, you know, we all experience that, whether it's at Muir Woods or at the beach or in Yosemite. The beauty of nature that grabs us and draws us in. So I just wanted to say that because in my classes that I teach on what I call the wild spirituality of nature, and I'm going to tell you later why I still use that word spirituality. In those classes, I like to point out, because I used to teach classes in world religions, and I really enjoyed teaching that class in congregations. Think about it. Teaching a course on other faiths in one particular congregation. And sometimes we had a good-sized class. People were curious. People really wanted to learn more and be drawn out into the questions, into the wildness of the questions. So I just told you a story of an experience in Yellowstone National Park. Susan told you a story of the Galapagos and being on an island where now the volcano's going off. So we tell these stories, and if we were following in the old traditions, we would say, believe me. Just believe my story. It really happened. That incredible thing happened, and I now came back out of that park, that wildness, and I'm telling you this story. You don't have to go. You don't have to go to Yellowstone. I'm telling you the story. Believe my story. Well, in my class, I like to point out, because we have people in my classes at college, the college we're in, that are, and even in some of those congregation classes, who are on the spectrum. Some are more free thinkers, some are really very devout, and they're ready to experience something new, to hear something different. So what I like to point out is something that I learned that helped me in my emergence from the Protestant tradition, from evangelicalism for a while, a little bit of Pentecostalism. Praise the Lord. You know, raise your hands. Right? So something I learned along the way is to ask one major question. Where did all the great spiritual teachers of history go to have their experience of wonder, enlightenment, silent wonder? Where did they go? They went to the forests, the mountains, the rivers, the deserts. They went to nature. I mean, isn't that kind of an obvious thing? And why doesn't anybody talk about that? Why isn't that something that's central? You know, I studied the Bible for many years. I went to a Christian college. I majored in religion and philosophy. We studied the Bible inside and out, and then began to study other holy books of the world. And then I went to seminary, spent my time studying all that stuff, the Hebrew, the Greek, the ancient literature. And nobody really raised that kind of thing, that kind of issue. Because here's the thing. All of those great spiritual teachers went out into nature, came back out of nature with some kind of an incredible message. Some of us would emphasize incredible message. And no one, as far as we know, no one asked one question. And I think if we all thought about it, we would immediately ask the question, can I go with you? Can you take me out there? You know, Chris, can you take me to Yellowstone where you had that amazing experience? Or Susan, will you take me to the Galapagos? Jesus, will you take me to the desert? Muhammad, will you take me to the cave? Buddha, will you take me into the forest? So we can have those experiences? No one asked that, as far as we know. No one ever asked. I think that's curious. I really think that's curious that people did not ask that question. If someone comes out of the wilds, Joseph Smith, he goes into a field, he finds these things, comes back with this incredible story, and nobody said, Hey, take me out in the field. Show me. Nobody did. I find that very strange that that has never been mentioned when people are studying the world religions. I think that's one of the fatal flaws in spirituality and religion, is that people aren't asking the most obvious, common sense, natural questions. Let's just be really real about this. You know, you say you had that experience. Show me. I want to hear that voice too. You know, I want to see that. I want to hear that. I want to feel that same thing. So the fatal flaw, as I see it in spirituality, is Thomas Paine gives us the hint. He says, well, people say they have these experiences. That's nice hearsay. That's nice hearsay. It's not revelation. You can't pass along revelation. And here's where someone like, and this is going to blow your mind because it did mine, when I realized that John Muir was one of the great spiritual teachers of our age from now 100 years ago. John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, John Muir, the naturalist, Mr. National Parks. Well, he always said to people, don't just believe my stories, you go out there. I just went to the mountaintop. Good. And what did he say? Let me just tell you my stories. Just read my books. That's all that matters. Read my books. Tell my stories. Pass along my stories. No. He said, I live to entice people into nature's loveliness. Isn't that great? I mean, that was his way of being kind of a reverse evangelist. Instead of saying, I've got the story to tell you. Believe my story. He says, I've got a really amazing story. I'm going to tell you my amazing story. Now, folks, get out the door. Go into the outdoors. You go out there. You experience that, and you're probably going to experience something very different. But you know what? It's all going to be beautiful. It's all going to be beautiful. It might kill you. Muir was pretty clear about that. You could also die out there because nature doesn't care. Nature doesn't care. The other person who helps us along the way, I think, is good old Emerson. Now, I'm sure Emerson in some circles, some secular circles, gets kind of a bad name. He was still a theist. He still had an understanding, kind of a pantheistic thing going on. But he said some pretty incredible things that I think we should carry with us. One of them is at the beginning of his essay on nature, where he says, why do we continue to look backwards and talk about other people's stories of meeting the divine out in nature? Why can't we have the universal relationship with nature that they had? So what's the whole history of religion? Well, back then, we're going to tell you some stories that happened back then, back there, to those people. I guess I'm sort of like naturally preaching to the choir here. Because I know that you get that. I think it's something that a lot of people have never really considered. It's like, have a spiritual, religious experience, the one that I have, and then you're a part of the community. Then you're a member. Now you can join us. That's a history of tribalism. Thinking alike because everybody says, I have the same experience. Well, I'm here today to talk about something that I have referred to as spirituality, natural spirituality. and that nature is enough. I had to learn the hard way that nature was enough. I had to go through the experience of working with people in congregations, and thankfully, thank goodness, that for many years I could work in an interfaith setting. And within that interfaith setting, it wasn't always faith. It was more the inter part that was important. So, nonprofit boards of directors that would come together, many of them I would invite to support me as a chaplain when I was working in the county jail system, then when I was working on the streets, when I was an instructor at a private school, and whenever someone died, they'd say, oh, he's that minister guy, he's a chaplain guy, have him do the memorial service. Well, I've done hundreds of memorial services, right, for people who were all kinds of things, all kinds of beliefs and non-beliefs. So I get something about this thing called chaplaincy. So for me to say nature is enough is to say the supernatural is not enough. In our culture, in our world, we're dealing with people who are saying the supernatural is the superior way. It's beyond the natural, and it's better than the natural. So hence we have all of these stories of the afterlife, and it's always better. Go where it's better. Well, I remember talking to many, many people in county jail cells and on streets and in the campsites where people would say, it's really going to be better when I'm gone. This is hell. I'm ready to move on to a better place. How do you address that? How do you try to help somebody when you no longer know, really, that's the way to comfort people, is to say, oh, it'll be better in the sweet by and by. Well, I don't think that really helps. I don't think that really helps. So as I went through, my own experience over many years, I had a heavy backpack of a lot of tradition, of those Bibles and the theology texts and all of that stuff and everything I'd been taught, and that was a kind of heavy backpack to be carrying along. But then I realized, hey, the world's pretty beautiful, and this is just holding me down. It's holding me back. And every time I'm dealing with people in a jail cell, on the street, someone with mental illness, do I just give them my backpack? Do I just tell them the old story? Or do I say, you tell me your story, right? Just like going out into nature. You say, what am I learning? What in the great classroom of nature? What am I being taught? Right? It's a reverse missionary approach. It's reverse evangelism, It's saying, I'm going to listen, I'm going to learn, not going to preach. And that was a big one for me, because when I was in seminary, we're taught that giving your sermon, spend days of your week working on a really good sermon, make it just a slam bam, excellent sermon to wow people. Those are the people that get paid a lot of money. Those positions, you get a lot of money for being a good preacher. I found that I became an outsider the more I practiced this natural chaplaincy, this edgy chaplaincy. When I discovered that a chapel doesn't mean a religious place, a chapel is a place where you go to listen and pay attention and learn. And, you never know who's going to be there. You really don't. So I would find the chapel experience, the natural chapel experience, in some of those, in protective custody cells in the county jail, in the bushes, literally, on hillsides in Marin County, where some people, live kind of comfortably in their own little campsite, just right looking down on million-dollar mansions. The people that have those views that people really want, pay a lot of money for. Well, there are people living, as we all know, right on those edges. And I kind of did the wild thing. I started thinking, hey, on those wild edges, maybe people have something to teach the rest of us. Maybe there's some wisdom there. Because where did all those great spiritual teachers come from? They were edgy people. They were the outcasts. They were on the edge. Unfortunately, those marginalized people, those kind of wild folks on the fringes, ended up becoming the great ones, greater than all of us, elevated, and we still do. We elevate the Oscar Romeros, right? We elevate these people and we say, oh, look, they're holier, they're more sacred, they're closer to the divine. But I think that what happens over time is when you're dealing with this thing I call natural spirituality, it becomes a bridge to something that's a supernatural. It's time to go beyond the supernatural. Encourage people to say, the supernatural is not helping. It's really not helping because we're losing the natural. We're losing nature that way. And we don't have to go far to see that kind of experience all around us in the world, with a disconnect from nature is a disconnect from our own nature, because our own nature is a part of nature. There is no difference. We're species are a part of all the species. E.O. Wilson, the biologist from Harvard, said that as fast as we're losing species on the planet, we're discovering new ones. So that's this continual cycle. We're losing species because we're basically too stupid to realize that we're interconnected, and we may need that species that we just killed off. And then we don't think that, okay, but we're species too, and we're explorers, and we're wanderers. So let me tell you that it's pretty incredible when you realize that we haven't discovered most of the species on this planet. We really haven't. And we may not be biologists, but we may be discovering those species. So next time you see some weird little beetle, or hear some bird you've never heard before or something, ask yourself, I wonder if anyone has ever seen that before. I mean, doesn't that sound wild to say that? But it could very well be true that we're seeing something or hearing something that's never been seen or heard. I think that's incredible. I think that draws us into participation in our world in a way that you really you don't see too much. You see a lot of observation, but not so much participation. It's like people talking about folks on the street. Well, I saw that person, or I saw that kind of thing. It's observation. Oh, I see that. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that. Right? But what about the participation? It's kind of like people used to ask me when I was a chaplain on the street. They'd say, somebody in a congregation very much wanted to help. And they said, so I want to help, and so I see this person every day, and I keep thinking I should give him some money. I should just give him some money. And I always said, well, why don't you just learn their name first? Start with a name. Start with the humanity and go from there. Because maybe the dollar's not going to help. But I can guarantee having a human interaction does help. So that's kind of what some of the things that I've learned as a chaplain, and I've got a lot of stories. I've got a book here called My Address is a River, and I collected a whole bunch of stories from those chaplain years. But I have to say that, the top thing here is secular chaplain. Irritates a lot of people. That's fine. And I'm willing to deal with the irritations because we're still trying to come up with semantics that work for the post-faith life. Maybe some of you didn't have faith in the first place. I understand that. But a lot of people have had some kind of faith tradition and have moved on. But so what do you do with that kind of that renewed secularity, coming back to the present world, nature? I mean, that's all it is. That's all we have is nature. So what do we do now with that? I like to use the model of chaplaincy because it works. It really works. I've seen it work. I've practiced it for 25 years plus. I still am doing that, drawing those qualities into the work that I do now as a housing manager and a teacher. I still practice the same things. So what does that mean? It means to be aware, to learn from the natural environment, which means we're a part of the natural environment. So learning from the people around us, whoever they are, and the lessons of nature, the other species on this planet. Drawing those into a practice of compassion. Everybody can do that. You're all doing it in your own lives in one way or another. So does it matter if a person has faith or not? I think that's an important question. I'm married to a minister. I have to be in relationship with people of faith. I'm a member of an interfaith council. They know that I don't believe in the supernatural. But mostly they're intrigued. They're intrigued, and they have some questions too. And once you kind of come out and say these things, sometimes people in the congregations and people of faith will kind of pull you aside. I know you've had this experience, and start kind of quietly ask some questions. Because people have some of the same questions that we've had in our lives. So I find that stimulating, I find that important, and it's one reason why I think that a good practice of chaplaincy is one that builds those bridges and keeps those relationships open. There's plenty of wall building, plenty of polarizing in the secular community and in the sacred community. We see it all the time. Polarize, polarize, polarize. I'm not interested in that. When I go online and I'm bantering around with people in the secular community, some people I can't relate to too much because they no longer relate to people of faith. I do. And I want to. Because a lot of people have faith. Because a lot of people are, in congregations, in religious experiences. But what I continue to like to try to do is keep drawing it back to what do we all appreciate? John Burroughs, one of my favorite naturalists is John Burroughs. 100 years ago, he was writing things. Here's one of his books. I'll pass this around. This is The Light of Day. Came out in 1900. I'll start this over here. John Burroughs, one of the most popular nature writers in the 19th century. Most of us have never heard of him. I didn't hear about him until about 10, 15 years ago. And a friend of John Muir's, a friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. Without these guys, we really wouldn't have these natural and national parks that I think are the new sanctuaries of a new religion, if you will. The religion of nature that's really emerging. I think that we've had 100 years now to kind of somewhat process some of these things, the John Muirs, and now the John Burroughs. So what do we do with all that? It's not about worship. It's not about having a supernatural, but it's finding sanctuary, because I think that's human. I think we need to find places of grounding and humanity to share together. So the two Johnnies are John Muir and John Burroughs. The quote there, the inside of the atom, comes from Woody Guthrie. And Woody Guthrie was steeped in the Bible like these guys were, like a lot of us maybe were in our lives, saturated with that holy book, right? So Woody Guthrie said that of all the Bible, only one verse really made any sense to him. And it's 3 words: God is love. That was the only verse that meant anything to him. God is love. So then he went on from there to say something that sounds a little bit like John Muir. He said, that love causes peace and harmony to whirl a whole new universe on the inside of every atom. Not a physicist, not a theologian, not a philosopher, Woody Guthrie. Love causes peace and harmony to whirl a whole new universe on the inside of every atom. Well, I like that. I think that's the edge of mysticism. It's approaching what mystics in various traditions have talked about, but they take that leap. They take it another step, because they say that's not good enough. We have to go to the next step of the supernatural. Well, I'm saying, okay, a lot of us have done that. We've taken the supernatural step. Let's be supernaturalists. Let's go the next step, which is really the circle. It's cycling back to simply being human beings in the natural world and finding that common ground literally. Like Susan was saying, you go to a place like the Galapagos, you go on an island, you're there with a group of people, and does it really matter what anybody believes or does not believe? It's beautiful. It's wonderful, right? And everybody is awestruck by that gorgeous beauty. John Muir, of all people, if you dig around in his journals, because once again, he was forced to memorize the Bible as a young boy in Scotland. John Muir was saturated in his brain, like some of us have been, with the Bible. So he knew it very well. In his journals and in other places, like in my first summer in the Sierra and other kinds of things, uses religious language. But what does he mean by that? You dig around, he says this. He says, let me find the exact quote here. He says, the natural and common is more truly marvelous and mysterious than the so-called supernatural. Indeed, most of the miracles we hear of are infinitely less wonderful than the commonest of natural phenomena when fairly seen. John Muir. Now, that's why I think John Muir was one of those secular chaplain kind of guys. He understood the religious traditions, and he used words that were bridges to the people who were holding on to that supernaturalism. And I appreciate that. I think we should appreciate the people who make those connections and keep those relationships, not disconnect, not polarize, not turn it into a war, because that just becomes destructive. It's just destructive. He goes on to say in his journals, oh, the infinite abundance and universality of beauty. Beauty is God. John Muir. Beauty is God. What shall we say of God that we may not say of beauty. Now, what if we had a new religion? The religion of beauty. Where do you go with that? What's that sacred text going to look like? It's going to be our stories of what's going on in our natural world. That would be the scripture. What would be our congregational experience? Our songs. What would our choir sing? Beauty. All about beauty. Now, Burroughs was great. He was kind of a good foil for Muir, because John Burroughs, even though he was also steeped in his own Christian background, he said, nature, yes, is full of beauty, and we need to appreciate that. But it also has disease and destruction and death, tornadoes and earthquakes and all these terrible things that happen. But see, we have an advantage over those people who make that into supernatural, give supernatural reasons for that. We can say, as Burroughs said, it just makes it more real, doesn't it? When we have these kinds of things happen, it just makes it more real. We can't deny that there's a bunch of bad stuff in nature and in our lives. We can't deny that. We shouldn't deny it. But we can face it without leaping past it, without trying to explain it away somehow. So, I guess probably pretty soon I'm going to ask for some comment and question. But I did want to say that quite often on my Secular Chaplain blog, I kind of do some bantering with, there's a lot of people out there who call themselves chaplains. And I'm kind of biased. I'm kind of biased about what a chaplain should and should not be doing. And let me tell you, I have a sense that we all ought to be concerned about this. Because I don't know if you've read much about military chaplaincies. Maybe you've come across chaplains in hospitals, jail chaplains, prison chaplains, hospice chaplains. A lot of chaplains running around. And chaplains, once again, are people that kind of are wandering out on the edges, doing whatever they think it's supposed to do as a chaplain. Right? But I'm really sensitive to what works and what doesn't work in chaplaincy. And let me tell you, I guess you've already picked up on my bias, but a chaplain is not a preacher. A chaplain is not a missionary. But if you pay attention, a lot of chaplains people who call themselves chaplains, and we have a vast number paid by our tax funds in the military, and the vast number of them are Christian, and a vast number are in the more conservative wing of the Baptists and evangelicals. If you pay attention to what they're doing on the battlefields among our service people out there, they're preaching. They're trying to win souls. When they go into Iraq and Afghanistan and other countries, they're trying to convince local people to give up their beliefs because they have a better belief. Our stories are better than your stories. Why? Because we're from America and we're Christian. Can you believe that? Can you believe that we support that? Well, I don't, and I speak up about it. Whenever I find a blog of somebody who's in a chaplain somewhere, anywhere, here in this country, other places, and they're telling their story of what they do in their chaplaincy, and it's all about preaching. It's about going into that county jail with your Bible, right? And you see someone reading the Quran, and you say, give me that. I've got something better, right? Now, we can have all the criticisms we want of Islam, but that's not right. That's not right to say, give me your holy book because I've got a better holy book. I can only say that partly because I used to teach world religions and because I was an interfaith chaplain. So I would bring Qurans to people in the county jail back in those days. This was a number of years ago. It's not like last week. But I would bring all kinds of religious literature to people, and I did that all the time. And you know what it did? It opened a lot of minds because people said, wait a minute, you're a chaplain. Chaplains are supposed to be Christians. And what are you doing here? Who are you representing? And I said, well, I'm representing this little group of people who are focused on what chaplaincy ought to be. Well, let's see, what is that? I used to say, I don't represent any one faith. I don't represent any one perspective. I'm here to represent compassion. Because all of those people in that little group that came together, the support group to support me as a chaplain, were from all these different faith communities, but they could put aside some of those differences and say, who do we care about in our community? We care about people in a county jail. Or in another incarnation, and when I was working on the street, we care about people who are seeking housing. So we're going to focus on that. Did it matter? When you walked into the room, could you say, oh, there's a Baha'i, you know, there's a Jew, there's a Roman Catholic, you know? You couldn't do that. Because you could walk in the room and you could hear people talking and say, wait a minute, they just care. They just care about what's going on with the inmates in the county jail or those people on the street. So they hire this wild guy who considers himself some kind of odd new brand of chaplain who's going to go out there because he's not a preacher. He's not a missionary. Well, he's a missionary for compassion. How do you do that? What holy book do you use? You know, when you're a missionary for compassion. So I know I'm hitting you with a lot of stuff here, and I don't know, maybe you've heard it all before, but I kind of doubt it. I left the interfaith way partly because when I left my ordination as a Presbyterian minister, I went to meet with my colleagues, about 300 people, and I said, folks, I'm moving on. I'm moving on. I no longer believe those creeds. And I said, one reason is because I've been working with people who are the outcasts for so long. They have wisdom. It's not being heard. You know? And I've read the Quran, and I've read the Tao, you know, and I've read the Buddhist literature, and I've read the Vedas, and I've read these things, and I've met people, real human beings, who represent those faith traditions. And I've met a whole lot of people that don't give a crap about religion. And a whole lot of people who just don't care because they just want care. They just want some help. They don't care who's helping them. You know, what's your badge say? You know, what does your little label say? Oh, I'm Catholic, I'm Protestant, I'm atheist. Sorry, but yes. It's not about the labels. It's about what we are as human beings, right? So now in my work as a teacher and as a manager of housing manager, sometimes people ask, you know, what is your belief? What is your faith? What is your religion? You know, some people heard along the way that, oh, you were a minister. You were a minister? How can you were a minister? You know, aren't you always a minister? Well, no. But what is ministry? What is chaplaincy? And that's when I can turn it back around to people who think they don't know anything and say, you know a lot. You know a lot. You have wisdom for the rest of us to hear, particularly if you feel like you've been an outsider for all those years. If you feel like you've been marginalized outside the doors of the holy temple, church, mosque, whatever, synagogue, right? If you feel like you've been an outsider all those years, well, wait a minute. Maybe it's all turned inside out. Maybe it needs to be turned inside out because the common ground happens then. When John Muir was a kid in Scotland, in Dunbar, I've been in that church where he and his family used to go, and I sat through a service that was one of the most dry, it was like dry cereal, the whole service. And I come from Scots Presbyterians, but I was in a Scots Presbyterian church, and I thought it was super dry. And at the end of that service, I couldn't wait for those doors to open, and there's the sea and the seashore and the beauty of Scotland. And I thought, yes, that's what happened to John Muir. He had to sit through those services. He had to read his Bible, but boy, did he ever enjoy his liberation when he got out the door. And that became his church. When he, years later, you probably heard this story, when Muir finally made his way to this fantastic heaven called Yosemite, he writes to his religious brother, and he says, I have been to church for the first time in California. It's called Yosemite. That's why that became a national park, because he believed that you preserve sanctuaries, you protect them. So that's exactly what John Muir did. And because he slept outside with a president of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, we know that story, 300 million acres preserved across the country. 300 million acres preserved by one president, partly because of going to Yellowstone. I think I told a story about Yellowstone. Sleeping outside in Yellowstone with John Burroughs, and then traveling over right away, this is in 1903, to Yosemite to camp outside, sleep outside under the stars, and get snowed on in Yosemite with John Muir. What does he do? He goes back to Washington, D.C., and we all know the rest of the story. So, they weren't the only ones to preach the gospel of nature, and that is their language. They used that language. But if you read them closely, I think you'll pick up some of the stuff that I'm talking about here. They use the words, the slippery words, even God, even the word God, and spirituality, those kinds of things. Even Bible. Muir said, I read the scriptures in the mountain ranges. Ooh, read the scriptures in the mountain ranges. So, what did he mean by that? Good, ask the question, explore it. I don't know, but it's interesting to me. He writes to his friends who were very religious, and they knew he had been very religious. But then he says things like, I read already to you, There are marvelous things out here in nature that are much more interesting, much more incredible than these supernatural stories. So that's John Muir. I'm going to cut my voice now so that you can participate in this a little bit, and we'll see where we go. So any thoughts, questions, glaring mistakes?
A robust discussion followed Chris's presentation. His books can be found at clergyproject.org on the resources page, Books and Blogs by TCP Participants.